When I first started sewing, all I wanted was for somebody to do each step of the pattern right there with me. And that's what this video is for today. We're going to show you exactly how to print, assemble, and even sew up the Love Notions Classic Tee. This is a pattern that can be found on the Love Notions website, and you can purchase it for just $5. It's a great introduction to sewing, whether you're new to PDF patterns, new to sewing garments, or new to sewing in general. This video is going to help you sew it up step by step. Let's go. And let's talk about what a PDF sewing pattern is. The reasons why I like PDF sewing patterns are because you can download them instantly. As soon as you find a pattern, you can have it. You can also use them an infinite amount of times, and they often come with really great instructions, really great tutorials, lots of sewing support, and the indie sewing pattern world and community is a really wonderful place to be to get help as you sew. So that's what a PDF pattern is as far as Love Notions is concerned. Now let's talk about how to access that PDF pattern. You'll first go into the Love Notions website. You'll find a pattern that you like. For this example, we're going to be using the Classic Tee. We're going to purchase that pattern, and then in your account on the website, you'll see that there's a download section. And you'll be able to download a variety of types of this pattern, and you can also access these files through the email that is sent to you with your order confirmation. Now, once you get these files, you'll have several options to choose from. One is a print at home option, which contains both the pattern tutorial, like all the instructions and everything, as well as a page-by-page version of the pattern that you'll assemble at home. The other types of files that are included with your purchase are a A0 or A0 large format print version of the pattern, which you can send off to a large format printer or a copy shop like Office or Staples or PDF plotting, and they'll print out a large scale picture of the pattern with the correct sizing and proportions and everything, and then they'll send that to you. And then another file that is included in your pattern purchase is a projector version of the pattern. This is a new technology that sewists are now using and loving, where you can install an overhead projector in your sewing space, and you can project the lines of the pattern directly onto your fabric with no need for any paper whatsoever. This is a pretty new technology. Lots of people love it, and if you want more information about that, there's a really helpful sewing PDF patterns with projectors Facebook group that you can join. But today we're going to be focusing on how to print this pattern at home. So we're going to be using the Classic Tee, and we're going to be printing off the copy of this pattern that says Print at Home Tutorial. There's a special way that you have to print these patterns, and it involves using a free program called Adobe Reader. You can download this program online and install it on your computer, and this is like a special viewer to make sure that the pattern prints correctly, because you know that it's so important to have all of the lines in proportion, and even if things are off just a little bit, it can mess up your whole pattern. So you'll be installing Adobe Reader to your computer or your device, and you'll download the pattern and open it up inside of this program. Once you get into this program, you'll open up that Classic Tee download or whatever pattern that you've got. You will look at the tutorial and you will decide what pages you want to print. This is another really great thing about PDF patterns. You only need to print the sizes and the versions of the pattern that you want. So even if the pattern has lots and lots and lots of pages, you can reference the print chart that is at the beginning of the tutorial, and you can just print out the options like the sleeves or the necklines or the types of the pieces of the pattern that you want. You can also only print the sizes that you would like. So it's so easy to set these options, and this again is another reason why PDF patterns are so useful. So once you're in Adobe Acrobat Reader, you will open up your new PDF pattern inside the program, and then you'll access the print chart and decide what pages you need to print. And then you'll go to the print selection and you will input the pages. And then one thing that you have to make sure that you do is that you select it to be printed as the actual size. It cannot be distorted in any way, or that will mess up the pattern. So once you have selected those options, you also want to check a couple other things. For me, I want to always print in black and white because I don't want to waste my color. And I also want to make sure that I do not have double-sided printing enabled on my printer. That will not do you any favors. Trust me, I know. So you'll go ahead and click print, and then you'll grab your pieces from the printer, and then we're on to the assembly step. Well, it's really simple. What we've got to do is just assemble them. You can use tape or you can use like a glue stick. And you're going to butt up each page against the line that's printed on the side and on around the perimeter of the pattern. And I'll show you how to do that right here. After the pattern is assembled and you've got all of your pieces together, it's time to cut out the pattern. You'll want to make sure that you're taking notice of all of the pattern markings and making sure not to cut off any important lines. And you're just going to go around the pattern. You can use scissors or you can use a rotary cutter. I prefer to use a rotary cutter that is one of my old ones, so I'm not using a fabric cutting tool, but I have a rotary cutter that is just for paper, and that makes cutting these pattern pieces out really quick and easy. All right, we've come so far. We've got our pattern downloaded, we have it printed, we have it assembled, and we even have our pattern pieces cut out and ready to go. So what's next? Well, we've got to introduce some fabric to the mix here. Before we show you my fabric that I'm going to be using and give you a couple tips on using fabric, I want to show you a couple tools that I'll be using to get my pattern pieces cut out of my fabric. My first tool is a rotary cutter. Make sure that this is a rotary cutter that you only use for fabric. You can also pin the fabric onto the pattern piece and then use like some nice scissors, but I prefer to use a rotary cutter. It just makes things go so much faster. Just watch out for your fingers. I also really love to use pattern weights. I like to keep these on top of the pattern so that it doesn't have a lot of shifting around as I'm trying to cut. And then you'll notice that there were lots of markings on the pattern pieces, and we're going to need to transfer those markings onto the actual fabric. I like to use a Magic Madeira pen, and it's just a purple pen that makes markings that erase in the wash. A lot of other people use friction pens or tailor's chalk or lots of other ways to mark onto your fabric. And of course, we're going to need all those pattern pieces that we cut out. For the classic tee, there's just 4 pattern pieces. When you get into more complex patterns, there could be 20 pattern pieces, but this pattern is really simple. It will only have the front, the back, the sleeves, and then a neckband, and then you'll be ready to cut out. Now, before we start cutting out, I want to share with you something that I did not know about until I started sewing for real. And that is how important grain line is when you're cutting out your pattern pieces. You'll notice that on your pattern pieces, it has a marking with arrows up and down that say grain line. You need to make sure that the grain line of your fabric matches up with the grain line of the pattern piece. You can't just put the pattern pieces anywhere you want on the fabric and just kind of play pattern Tetris. You could definitely save a lot of fabric if you did that, but you would not end up with a project you were happy with. So let me show you my fabric. I'm going to be using a double brushed poly fabric. It's a lightweight knit fabric. I got this from Serge Fabric Shop. And if you want any more information on where to shop for fabric online, what kind of fabric is right for what kind of project, how to do anything when it comes to fabric, check out the lovenotions.com blog and search fabric, and you will find tons of resources, including different projects made up in different fabrics, because fabric can change everything on a pattern. So here's my fabric, and I want to show you that there are these like kind of curly edges of the fabric. They look like this, they kind of rolled over a little bit, and then there's a little like marking that you can see, like an impression was made by like some kind of piece of machinery. And this was done when the fabric was created, and this is called the selvage edge. And what I like to do to find grain line on my fabric is to match up selvage edge to selvage edge. And perpendicular to this, this is the cut line. This is how it was cut off of the bolt. And our grain line is going to almost always go perpendicular to the selvage edge. So I like to fold my fabric up, and this is a 2-yard cut. I like to fold my fabric up like this, make sure I have a fold edge over here, and I'm going to place this onto my cutting table so that I can clearly identify the grain line and then match up the grain line with my pattern piece's grain line. Let me show you how. All right, at this point, I've brought my fabric back over to my cutting table. Here is the folded edge of my fabric. And the reason why I'm being careful with the folded edge is because the pattern pieces, if you look at the directions that are on the middle part here, it says cut one on fold. So I have to make sure that I have a folded edge to place this line against. But before I do that, I want to make sure that this fabric is completely flat and straight. So instead of pulling on it, I like to kind of flip it out a little bit and let it fall naturally. If you pull on it, it could distort the fabric, and the thing that you end up, that you've cut, might not stay in the right shape. The other thing you want to know is you do not want to have fabric hanging over the edge of your cutting table, because that'll cause it to pull and drag, and whatever you cut here will kind of like pop back into a different shape. So you want everything to be nice and flat. And this is a 2-yard cut of fabric. The classic tee I can almost always get out of a 1-yard cut, but if I'm very, very careful with fabric, but I'm going to show you how to do it with a 2-yard cut of fabric. And so I'm going to take this front bodice piece, I'm going to line it up against the folded edge of my fabric. And then I'm going to stick a pattern weight on it, pattern weight or 2. And then before, I took careful note of some of the markings. Now I could, as I'm cutting, kind of make a little triangle that pops out as I'm cutting. Usually I just mark it with my magic pen marker, but you could do it however you would like to. So I've got one pattern piece all set here, and I'm gonna cut this out. If you want to do more of like a batch, you can lay all of the pattern pieces out at once and cut all together, but as far as our camera, it's just easier for me to cut these out one at a time. So I'm just gonna go through, make sure everything is super smooth, nothing's tight or caught anywhere. I'm gonna make sure this is all lined up, and then just double check that I know that I'm cutting this on the fold. So I'm ready to cut. It's important that you replace your rotary cutter blade pretty regularly. A dull rotary can be pretty dangerous when you're trying to like press down and cut through fabric. So using a sharp blade, just like in the kitchen, it's usually better to use a sharp knife and not have to press so hard than it is to use a dull one. So I'm going to go through, just cut against all of the lines as close as I can to the pattern piece. Some people don't even use pattern weights, they just hold it down with their hand, but I like using weights. And then I just have to cut this last part right here. And again, if you wanted to, instead of making a marking with like a utensil, you could cut out a triangle here for that arm side marking. But I'm just gonna cut through, make sure I get every layer. There we go. And then I'm gonna grab my pen. And then I'm just going to mark on the inside like that. Now this is my front. Sometimes it's important to keep track of which piece is the front and which piece is the back, and it's hard to identify. I know that this is the front because it's the scoop neck, but if you were using the crew, you might want to take like a safety pin or a big clip or something and put it on one of the pieces to be able to identify it easily. Now I'm ready to cut out the back. I'm just going to move my fabric down. I'm going to shake it out a little bit, make sure nothing's caught, make sure it's all flat, make sure there's nothing underneath. Sometimes extra pattern pieces or extra fabric scraps can get underneath and kind of distort things, so just make sure it's all nice and smooth and flat. And then I'll put my pattern for the back down. And like we said before, there's lots of markings here. So you'll notice that in contrast to the marking for the front, where there was where there was one marking for the front arm side, the back arm side has 2 markings. Now this is another way to keep track of which is the front and which is the back. So usually 2 T markings means that it's the back arm side or the back sleeve. And you'll also see these kind of triangles here. Now this is the length and shorten line. I believe this also coincides with the waist marking for this pattern piece. And so you can make sure that these triangles match up when you're sewing these pieces together. And you can also cut on this line and make this shorter as a pattern piece, or even give it more length if you have like a longer torso and need to make an adjustment that way. These paper pattern pieces can easily be held up against you so that you can kind of see where things will fall on your body. A lot of people like tissue patterns because they're easier to tissue fit, but paper patterns, you can do almost all the same things by just holding them up to your body. And now, next up is our sleeves. Sometimes sleeves can take up more fabric than you think that they're going to. So always make sure that you account for fabric, especially if it's a long sleeve pattern piece. It can really take up a lot of fabric, especially if you're being careful with your grain line. So here's my grain line marking, and I am just lining this all up. So this is the grain line of the fabric, and I'm matching that up with the grain line of the pattern piece. You can see that there is a 1 T marking on this side, and there's 2 T markings on this side, along with a marking for the shoulder point. And all of these markings will correspond to another piece marking. So we have to be careful to keep track of those. Now I am going to go ahead, get that other fabric all out of the way, and I'm going to use my pen and put in the markings just like I did with the other. Now the last thing to cut out is the neckband. Now again, this pattern piece has a grain line, and neckbands, while they're pretty thin and skinny, they do need to have the right amount of the right grain line and the right stretch. So you can see that we have this arrow that shows that the fabric should stretch the most against this line, and then we know the grain line is here, and then we have a fold line here. So I'm going to place this pattern piece with the fold right over here, and I'm only going to need one of these, and I'm going to cut this out. I do not need my pattern pieces anymore, but I am going to save those for another project. And I have my front, I have my neckband, I have my sleeves, and I have my back. So now we are ready to assemble. All right, now we're ready for the next step in the process, and there's a couple new tools that I want to tell you about. The first one is clips. You can use pins or clips. I like using these Wonder clips to clip my fabric in place, and I would highly suggest grabbing a big collection of those. You can find the knockoff kind on Amazon pretty cheaply. The actual Wonder clips themselves, the brand name ones, are kind of expensive, but they're really good quality. Another thing that you're going to want to have as you start to sew is some kind of snips. We like these thread cutters. They have a little extender thing that you can clip on to yourself or to your sewing machine. You are always going to need a little pair of snips as you sew. And these are really sharp and very, very handy. Make sure that you've got a seam ripper ready to go just in case. It's so important to have your measurements correct. So I like using this little seam gauge to measure things up as I'm sewing, because otherwise you might take it in too much or have it out too far. So this kind of just keeps me on track as I sew. So the first step that we do with the classic tee is we are going to be matching up the shoulders of the front and the back pieces that we've cut out. And we're going to be doing that right sides together. If you're following along in your tutorial, it'll have the words right sides together. And basically that means that you take the right side of the fabric, usually the part where there's the print or the, a different kind of texture, and you will put that together with the other piece that you're going to be sewing it to. You're going to be doing that right sides together. And we're just going to match these up just as perfectly as we can. In sewing, there's a right side of the fabric and a wrong side of the fabric. So obviously this non-printed side is the wrong side of the fabric. So right sides together, or RST, we're going to be pinning or clipping these shoulder seams together. Now when you get to be a more experienced sewist, you might not even need to put clips or pins in. Some people don't even bother with it once they get to a certain point, but as a newbie, I would definitely use the clips and the pins as much as possible. Now with knit fabric, things can get distorted kind of easily, kind of stretched out, kind of a little weird sometimes, especially when you take it over to the sewing machine. So I would take every opportunity to kind of straighten things out, make sure that nothing's pulling, make sure that it's all nice and flat as possible. And so now our next step is going to be to sew a side seam, just a stitch from one end to the other along this line right here. Now, because this is knit fabric, we don't want to use just a straight stitch. That kind of stitch doesn't have enough stretch with how stretchy our fabric is. So we're going to be using something called a lightning stitch, which has a slight zigzag in it. The other option that some more experienced sewists have, they use a serger. A serger is a different kind of sewing machine that uses 3 or 4 threads, and it really finishes off all the edges of this. When I was first sewing, I started with just a regular sewing machine, but eventually I got to a place where I really wanted to have a fully finished, enclosed seam on the inside. I wanted the inside to look just as nice as the outside. And some people choose to use a serger for that, but beginning sewists only need a sewing machine. And in fact, we just had a blog posted about how to get a professional finish using just a sewing machine with knits. It is really not that hard to do, but you're going to be wanting to use some sort of zigzag or a lightning stitch so that this line of stitching that's put in here has enough give. All right, we're back over at the sewing machine. We're finally ready to get sewing. Let me show you my sewing machine and what I'll be using today to help me get this classic tee done. I'm using a Baby Luck Brilliant. This is a great sewing machine. We love using this. It's a really dependable machine. It has lots of really functional options and stitches. We love the buttonhole feature on this machine. It is very good and always reliable. And it's just really dependable. It's got a knee lift, which means that you can use your knee to make the presser foot go up and down. You can start with the needle in the down position, which we love. And it's got lots of stitches. So like I said before, we're going to be using a stretch stitch on our classic tee today. We're going to be using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And let me put that lightning stitch in. For my machine, it's number 8, and it looks like a little bit of a lightning. Now, we can also choose our stitch length at this point, and I'm just going to go with a 2.5 stitch length. We don't need anything too long. We don't need anything super short. So now we're going to line up the needle with about 3/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, and we're going to sew one line down on each of the shoulder seams. So I'll get that done right now. I brought my piece back to my cutting table, and I'm going to now attach the sleeves. If you look at the pattern instructions, this is the next thing that is on our list to do. So we completed the shoulder seams and we've got those laying nicely. And now we're going to take those sleeves that we cut out and we're going to attach them to the opening of the arm. So remember when we made those markings, we have to make sure that we match those up correctly. So this is the front of the pattern of the classic tee, and I remember that we put a marking that was 1 tee that will match up with the 1 tee of our sleeve, and then there was the 2 tees that we marked right here that we're going to match up with the other sleeve. Now these sleeves are not interchangeable. There is a different curve on the front and a different curve on the back. So we have to make sure that the right sleeve gets matched up with the right arm side. So the way we figure that out is by looking at the markings that we made. So both of them have the triangle at the top, and then both of them have a double T marking. And what we're going to do is match up right sides together, the triangle, and we're going to pin that in place. We're going to match up the triangle marking with the seam of the shoulder. Then we've got our single marking, our single T, and that's going to match up with the single T on the arm side. So we're going to match those up together. Should be just about right. Use a pin or a clip for that. And then we need to match up the double T marking over on the other side with the double T marking that was on the back bodice. And this kind of feels like a jumbled mess right now. When you get used to it, you know exactly where everything goes, but it can kind of feel overwhelming because basically what you're doing is trying to get these curves on the shoulder and on the bodice pieces to match up. And they have to, one is kind of going like this and one is kind of going like in a different way, and we're trying to make them move together. So we're going to be fitting this shoulder sleeve piece over a 3D object. So we have to have fabric that has some room in it. So that's why it's a little bit weird to see when it's your first time doing it. So I like to match up all of those markings first, and then I'm going to go back through and I'm going to match up the ends. So here is the end of the sleeve. I'm going to match that up with the end of the arm opening. I'm going to do that on the other side as well. And then I am going to match up the rest of these so that it kind of can get together. Now the sleeve piece and the arm side should not really stretch at all. These lines are exactly the same length, so they should all match up. It's just that the fabric kind of feels like it's getting jumbled up. Now if you sew that together and you don't have it pinned nicely and the fabric lined up, you're going to end up with lots of puckers and uneven fabric. So it's really important to get these pinned in place before you try to sew. So I like to match them at the markings first, and then go back through and put pins in or clips into those empty spaces on the arm side. And the arm side is just kind of a fancy term for the opening where the arm goes. So now that I've got all these pins in here, you can see kind of looks like the beginning of the sleeve. And what I'm going to do is sew along this line using that stretch stitch. I'm going to do the exact same thing over on the other side, and I'll meet you at the sewing machine. When it comes to sewing on your sleeves, I suggest working with the actual sleeve pattern piece on top of the other pattern piece because it's just easier to keep things in order. We're going to be sewing again with the 3/8 inch seam allowance. And with that lightning stitch, again, we're just gonna sew from the edge of this line right here all the way to the end. We're gonna repeat that on both sides, and then we're gonna press and get the side seam sewn next. Now for following the pattern instructions, our next step is to sew the side seams. So in order to sew the side seams, we're gonna flip this inside out, and we're going to match up the end of one side seam with the other, all the way through to the sleeve. So I'm gonna start by pinning the end of the sleeve, and then I'm also gonna pin this end where the sleeve and the bodice of the pattern meet. I'm gonna pin that right there, and pin here. And then I'm gonna pin all the way at the end of the pattern, at the end of the t-shirt. It's looking pretty much like a t-shirt now, which is super exciting. And then I'm gonna clip all the way through here, and then we're gonna sew that exactly the same way as we did before with our 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I'm just gonna line all this up, making sure not to stretch anything. All of these lines should meet just exactly right. So remember, we had this marking for our waist, or the length and shorten line. We're gonna clip those together. And I love this t-shirt. It has just the right amount of ease for me with still some shaping. You can kind of see the shaping that this t-shirt has. Just goes in, just nips in just a little bit. Still very comfortable, relaxed fit to wear, but it has some shaping that I really appreciate. So I'm gonna do that to the other side as well. I'm gonna start by matching up the edges of the arm side. And I'll go down here and match up the edges of the bottom of the t-shirt where the hem is. I'll go ahead and get this little bitty piece here for the sleeve. And I'm going to match up the waistline markings. Another thing I love about PDF patterns as well, really just sewing in general, is that you're able to customize the fit of your clothing to your body. So sometimes, not for this pattern necessarily, but not right now, but a lot of times my top, my bust will be a smaller size than my hips will be. And I love being able to customize my sewing garments by using a smaller size bust pattern piece with a larger size on the waist. Like, you never find mixes like that in the store. So I love being able to do that for myself. So I've got my side seam clipped here, and while I'm here, I am also going to get started on the neckline, just as long as we've got everything set up over here. So we're gonna be attaching this neckband to this neckline area. And the way that we're going to do that is by folding this neckband piece onto itself, right sides together, and then we're going to sew this line right here. We're going to sew that line. So I'm just going to get that clipped and ready to go. Then the other thing that we've got to do is mark the quarter points of this neckline. That means that we're gonna mark in 4 equal spaces around the neckline so that we can attach this neckline evenly without part of it being really tight in one area and then really loose in another area. We want all of the neckband to stretch equally around the neckband, or around the neckline. So I like to take just a couple of clips, take 4 clips, there's 4 quarters, and I'm going to mark at the front and the back right at that center front and center back line. Now, when I first started doing this, marking the quarter points and learning how to put a neckband on, I thought that, well, you would just put one in the front, one in the back, and then one at each of the shoulder seams. But if you look at the neckline for a sewn, well, really any shirt, this is these shoulder seams, they're not equally distributed. So like if I were to just put a clip here, have one clip here, one clip here, one clip here, one clip here, like that's not the quarters. So what I'm gonna do to find the quarter points is I'm going to take my shirt and I'm gonna match up the front and the back clips. Then I'm gonna slide my finger in through here, don't pull and stretch. And then when I have these kind of on top of each other, I know that this line and this line behind here are both equal. And so actually, this spot right here is the quarter point. This is exactly the same size as this, and we're gonna do that on the other side as well. So it wouldn't have worked if we had taken the shoulder seams as our quarter point. So I'm gonna mark right here. And then I'm just gonna flip this out for you so you can see what this looks like to have your quarter points marked. So here we go. We have 1 point right here, one right here, one right here, one right here, and each of these lines is exactly the same amount. And then I'll show you how to mark your quarter points on this neckband, and then we're gonna meet these up together and sew them on to get a nice neckband. All right, at this point I have sewn and pressed my side seams. So I have that on both of the sides of the shirt. And while I was over at the machine, I also sewed my short ends of the neckband together. So they looked like this initially, and I sewed them again with a 3/8 inch stitch. And then I pressed the little flaps, the little seam allowance there, I've pressed that flat. Now we're ready to work with the neckband. So in order to make the neckband, we're actually gonna fold this neckband over so that this line of stitching meets itself on the other side. And we're gonna pin that or clip that, and we're gonna fold over the entire neckband wrong sides together. We're gonna make kind of like a loop. And our plan with this neckband is to mark the quarter points again. So I've got the top and the bottom. I'm gonna go ahead and mark those. And then to find the middle points where the rest of the quarter would come from, I'm just going to fold this over again so that these clips can meet each other. And then I will know that this end right here marks a quarter, and then this end over here marks a quarter point as well. So this is all folded wrong sides together to make like a loop. So this is what our neckband looks like right now. We need to make this neckband get attached over to this neckline opening. Now this neckline opening is much bigger than this neckband. So we're gonna have to stretch this slightly to fit onto this t-shirt. And so we're gonna wanna make sure that that stretch is distributed evenly throughout the band. One thing you wanna note is that when you're attaching the band, you wanna make sure that the seam, the part where you sewed together the band to make the loop, you wanna make sure that is in the back of your t-shirt. You probably wouldn't wanna have this right front and center on your t-shirt. So I'm going to turn my t-shirt. So far, I'm gonna turn this right sides out. And I'm going to align each of the quarter points with one of these clips that I have marked. And I'm gonna start by matching this one with the seam. I'm gonna match it to the back. And when I match these up, I'm going to try and place the band right sides together with the t-shirt. So I'll be able to take away one of those clips and then just use one to align the band. So I'm gonna be matching these up, and I want them to meet raw sides, like match up the raw edges but on the right side of the t-shirt. I'm gonna flip this over. Try not to get this twisted because that could really make a mess. So I'm gonna do these quarter points first, and then I'm gonna come back around through and pin even more. Some people use just tons of pins on a neckband because a neckband is definitely the place where you can run into the most trouble when you're sewing something, some kind of clothing. Neckbands are notorious for getting puckered or just not laying correctly, and so it's really important to have those quarter points matched up just right. And again, you're gonna wanna stretch that neckband just a little bit to fit. And so I'm gonna clip in, and man, I'm gonna just use a ton of clips. So what I like to do is between my quarter points, I have my band that's on top here, and then I've got my fabric, and I want this to all like lay in one nice line, but I do not want to stretch the actual t-shirt in order to get the band on. So I'm just gonna lay my t-shirt out in like a nice flat way, and then I'm gonna just gradually stretch my band to meet up right in the middle there, and then I just put in a bunch of clips, but I, again, just don't stretch the actual neckline opening itself because everything will just get really distorted then. And again, it just kind of feels like one big jumbled mess until it doesn't, until it gets all attached together. So I've got my neckband here. I'm just gonna stretch it slightly, try not to stretch the neckline itself, hold that in place right in the middle, and then come back in with some more clips on the other edges. And you'll see that that stretch gets distributed evenly around the t-shirt. And it's important to have a neckband that kind of draws in the opening just a little bit so you don't have a gaping opening on your neckline. You want that to be nice and snug against your skin. And if you were gonna do a V-neck, there's a kind of a little bit of a, same theory, but a little bit of a different way of attaching that. It's a little bit more complicated, so I recommend starting with the crew neck or the scoop neck on your first t-shirt sewing project. You don't want to probably go for a V-neck quite yet because it's just a little bit more, more steps. But we do have a really great tutorial for getting a perfect V-neck on our YouTube channel. Noreen is one of our ambassadors, and she just did the most, we get comments on that video all the time. We probably have thousands and thousands of views on that video with her V-neck tutorial. So if you get your scoop neck done or your crew neck done and are ready to go ahead with a V-neck and ready for the challenge, make sure you check out Noreen's video. So I've got my neckband clipped on to my t-shirt, and I'm just gonna do my 3/8 inch seam allowance at the sewing machine with my stretch stitch. All right, I'm all done. I went ahead and finished my neckband and attached it. I also went around and top stitched the neckband to the seam allowance and to the main bodice piece. And so I've got a nice flat neckline. I also went around and pressed and top stitched my sleeves as well as the hemline of my shirt. I love the way this shirt fits. It feels amazing. And I just feel like the process was pretty easy and pretty straightforward. So I hope that you can sew a classic tee just like this, and I promise you it will be like a gateway into a whole new world for you. Sewing is one of those things that you just keep on learning skill after skill after skill. At the beginning, it feels like, how can I possibly do this? And learn all of these things and buttonholes and collars and working with woven fabrics and fitting and bust darts, and there's just so many things. And then you just take it one step at a time, and you read the instructions and you watch videos and you ask questions, and then you learn it. And it's such a beautiful process to be able to sew your own clothes. So I am thrilled with my classic tee. A couple of things that you might want to do at the end of your sewing project are to really press your garment really well. That'll get out any little stray wrinkles, or like sometimes you can even press out like a little pucker. And you also will want to go through and take some thread snips and just get all those little stray snips everywhere. And of course, you have to go and take a picture and share it with us. You can find more sewing support at the Love Notions Pattern Support Group, which is a free and private group on Facebook. There's like 52,000 people on there who all love sewing as much as we do, and they're there to give help and encouragement and inspiration. You can also find lots of help on the Love Notions blog. We're also on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. We're all over the place. So if you want easy sewing patterns that will help you as a beginner sewist, make sure that you check out Love Notions. If you visit our beginner page at lovenotions.com, you can get tons of resources specially curated for beginners. We've got tutorials on fabric and grainline and how to use, what kind of needles to use, and sewing machine feet, and all those things that you didn't even know that you needed to know when it comes to sewing. We've also got a great collection of very much beginner-friendly sewing patterns there that you can see in both knits and wovens, and I think that you'll find everything you need as a beginner sewist. So we look forward to seeing you on our groups and interacting with you in the sewing community. Welcome.